Hi, you're listening to the Innovation Game podcast by IP law firm Potter Clarkson. My name's Rich Wells. I'm a senior associate patent attorney in the life sciences area, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jane Wainwright. I'll let you introduce yourself, Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Wainwright. I'm also in the life sciences area, and I'm a partner in the department, and I'm really looking forward to this chat.
No, it should be good. So the topic of conversation today is creating value from innovation. So just to kick us off, what do you think of when you hear that phrase, Jane?
I think it's quite an interesting one, Rich, that lots of people understand that intellectual property exists and that arises from innovation. But I think that a lot of people don't realize that innovation comes from so many different places and what value that can actually have. And there's patents, there's trademarks, there is copyright, there's designs. And so there's lots of ways that value for any company can be created.
No, that makes sense. I suppose it's that the innovation alone doesn't necessarily equate to value. I guess it can be quite valuable, but there's often other things to do to sort of cement your position to actually realize that value in what you've done, I guess. And we'll explore that a bit more as we talk on the subject a bit more. So just to kind of bring this conversation to life a bit, I think we'll look at a few IP related news stories that are hitting the headlines at the moment. The first of which is quite unavoidable in the UK at the moment. It's the heady heights of the Colin the Caterpillar versus Cuthbert the Caterpillar supermarket battle. So just as a bit of an introduction, Colin the Caterpillar is a caterpillar shaped cake made by the retailer M&S. It launched about 30 years ago. And there's a rival now on the market, Cuthbert. It's been released by another supermarket chain, Aldi. And earlier this month, M&S filed at the High Court in the UK, essentially a case against Aldi and Cuthbert for trademark infringement. And that's sort of where we are with the story. And there's obviously some sort of social media battles going on in the background. But, what's your take on this, Jane?
Well, I think it's quite an interesting one, apart from the fact that I love cake. So I could be either Team Colin or Team Cuthbert. I don't really mind. But I think it's a really interesting one because there is so much that M&S have been doing, and in terms of Colin, they've been using Colin as a cake for many years. Many people know that he exists. And so clearly Marks and Spencer's M&S have created a lot of value for themselves by being consistent with the use of Colin, and how he looks and hopefully how he tastes. And certainly one of my understandings of one of the things that M&S say that there is a problem with what Aldi are doing with Cuthbert is that they say that Aldi are trading off their brand with Colin, but selling an inferior product, and clearly they're concerned about that and how that might impact on what someone might think about their own Colin, and whether they lose value because they lose sales, because people might try a caterpillar at a kid's birthday party, say, and not realize that it's the Aldi versus the M&S one. So their IP in that sense is the trademarks are creating value by associating quality with the particular images and brand that M&S have created.
So in many ways, I suppose M&S they are using that IP for what it's designed for. They're trying to protect their market position and what they see as a superior product. But obviously there's kind of the charity angle as well, because I know M&S donate at least some of the profit from selling Colin to, is it Macmillan Cancer Support? And I guess there's that to consider as well. And I think Aldi, Cuthbert's, they're also donating to a charity, the Teenage Cancer Trust. So there's these kind of considerations as well that I think makes it quite interesting from a social media perspective, how they're bringing these points to bear.
I think it's quite interesting, the social media battle that has been going on, because you could can clearly see that Aldi are creating value for themselves out of someone else's IP, which is clearly a no-no. That's why IP rights exist, is to prevent that. But it's not just Aldi benefiting off this. You can see all sorts of third-party players that are using Team Cuthbert and Team Colin in their social media, and really bringing the kind of the buzz that is going around this. And it's not very often you get to talk about buzz in relation to IP.
No, not at all. It's true though, because I think most of the comments that I saw on social media weren't necessarily discussing the merits of the case in any way. They were almost just pining after caterpillar shaped cake more than anything. So whether it's Team Colin or Cuthbert that's winning on the sales now, I'm not particularly sure.
I'm sure there are plenty of people buying both to do a comparison, and maybe we should do that for our listeners at some point. Potentially,
yeah, just be us eating cake. I wouldn't want to ask whether that would be better than what they're listening to right now, but yeah, we'll move on from that. So I think that it's kind of an interesting situation. I think it is bringing IP more into the public domain as well, which is quite a good thing. And I suppose it's showing what it can do in some ways, how it can create value for companies. And for the charities, comes back to that charity angle, that not just is the IP creating the value for M&S or Aldi or whoever, that the charities are benefiting from that IP. And I think that's a really nice moral and ethical point to be thinking about. No, that's true. And you know, staying on that moral and ethical point, I suppose we can kind of move on to another topic that's IP related and in the news right now, and that's discussions about the potential of waiving patent rights to COVID therapeutics. So I guess this kind of cropped up in this form last year when the Indian and South African governments were petitioning the World Trade Organization to encourage the waiving of patent protection for COVID therapeutics, and it's kind of jumped back into the news recently, where I think 175 former world leaders and Nobel laureates have written a letter to President Biden in the US, encouraging him to do something to waive IP rights to COVID vaccines, I think specifically in this case. So on this topic, what do people want to achieve by encouraging the waiving of these COVID related patents? I mean, there are lots of moral and ethical dilemmas that go with this, and clearly by waiving IP rights, it smooths the passage towards anybody being able to manufacture and distribute COVID vaccines and therapeutics, and that is of particular interest in relation to low-income countries. And I think some of the data about the vaccination programs comparing high-income and low-income countries really back up how important this is. It's something like 1 in 4 adults in high-income countries have had at least one vaccine dose, whereas it's less than 1 in 500 in low-income countries. And if those countries were able to manufacture and distribute much more easily, then they would be able to administer the vaccines much more readily to their populations. So that there are clear benefits to waiving IP and allowing companies and entities to manufacture these drugs. But it isn't the whole story in the sense that smoothing the way through IP not being waived doesn't mean that any particular company or country could actually manufacture, because there may be other constraints, such as supply of the underlying ingredients for the drugs, or they're having the facilities to manufacture. So it isn't quite as simple as waiving IP. No, I think that's true, because I think the US still has an embargo over sort of 37 raw ingredients that it sees as essential for making vaccines. It refuses to allow their export, and I imagine that most of the facilities that are currently up and running, able to create the vaccine in the world, are already being used for that purpose. So, like you say, there's other constraints other than, I imagine, IP protection that is limiting vaccine production. And as well, I've not sort of done a forensic examination of what's out there, but from what I can tell, there's not yet any evidence out there that any patents relating to COVID vaccines are actually slowing production, or any patent owners are enforcing their rights against third parties that are trying to make COVID vaccines. And so I suppose at the moment it might be difficult to see how a waiver would help in the current situation, but you can certainly see, as you were saying, that if you do break down those walls of protection, then it does mean that third parties in this quite unprecedented time could produce the vaccine in places where it's most needed.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there doesn't seem like, you're right, that doesn't seem like that there is much enforcement of COVID related IP going on. But actually, there are indications that companies are collaborating. I know that Moderna have signed to have Sanofi, another big pharma company, manufacture their vaccine. I know AstraZeneca have outsourced some of their manufacture to other pharmaceutical companies. So there does seem to be collaboration going on between these companies. Clearly, there will have been licensing to allow them and agreements to do that. But I think we also know, certainly AstraZeneca, and I'm positive that the other manufacturers are doing something similar, are selling the vaccines that they are making at cost in low-income countries. The COVAX scheme is ensuring or helping to ensure supply to many of these countries. So the kind of the normal allegations that get laid against IP in terms of it's just about big pharma trying to make as much money as possible and prevent others from getting in on that market doesn't seem to be bearing fruit, at least in the present situation. That's not to say it's not going to be enforced in due course when actually the world's been vaccinated and it becomes just a more routine year-on-year booster. But while we're in the current unprecedented pandemic times, there is definitely an air of collaboration between these companies, and it does seem that IP exists but isn't being enforced against others.
No, that's true, and you make a good point. As you know, when we hopefully soon come out of this pandemic, then way that companies are approaching the enforcement of IP around these vaccines might change. But I imagine, at that time where there's less pressure, then maybe a waiver would have less of a place in the world potentially, and maybe these companies would deserve to have a bit more control over their products. I know the BioNTech CEO, I think, said quite recently that he doesn't see waivers necessarily as being the answer for the production of the vaccine. I think he didn't specifically sort of talk too much more on this point, but my general understanding was, them as a company do want a certain amount of control over the quality of the way that these vaccines are produced, and that can be done through license agreements, with trusted third parties. And if there are waivers against the IP, and anyone can produce essentially a company's sort of proprietary vaccine, then there might be a slight loss of quality control, which wouldn't necessarily be particularly good for anyone, I imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a regulatory expert, but each company that makes a vaccine is going to have to get some kind of regulatory approval. So just because the AstraZeneca or the Pfizer BioNTech has been approved by various bodies around the world, that doesn't mean to say that somebody else using the same technology is not going to also have to then get separate regulatory approval. So it doesn't necessarily make it easier. I think for me, one of the other key aspects of IP waivers potentially not being that helpful is that the big guys, the big pharma, they can afford this on a one-off basis. They can cope with selling at cost because they will be working on other drugs and be able to make money for their shareholders in other ways. But it's the smaller companies, the SMEs, which may be specializing in COVID or just vaccines or viral therapeutics, and this forms a large part of what it is that they're doing. Putting in place IP waivers that then prevents SMEs from enforcing their IP could be really detrimental to their commercial goals and the health of their business.
That's true. That's true. That point, should we move on to sort of talk a bit more about, well, what does sort of creating value from innovation mean for companies like this, particularly SMEs? How do those particular business models benefit most from having IP protection?
Yeah, well, when you think about innovation, it does have value, and small companies may only be working in one area or a very limited number of areas, so they need to be able to maximize the benefits that they can get commercially from those areas that they're working in, and that comes primarily from their intellectual property. If you obtain and maintain IP rights relating to your unique selling points, your innovations, then that is how you distinguish yourself from your competitors, and is how you prevent your competitors from getting a march on your territory in terms of what it is that you want to sell. And that's not just in the pharma area, in the life sciences area, that's in every kind of technology area and type of business.
That's true. I guess if you are going to, if you put money and time into generating your product, your service, then you do need to try and stop copycats, basically kind of coming in on your coattails and being able to dislodge you by maybe copying what you're doing for a lower price, either through where they can manufacture, or simply because they don't need to recoup those research costs. I think it can be quite important. I think one thing though that I'd say it's a misconception, but I think sometimes it's a fair criticism of the IP world, particularly about obtaining, granted patents in a number of countries, is there is an element of expense to it, which can be quite challenging for, small SME companies at the beginning of their journey to bear. And yeah, I guess it's important to balance these outgoings with the health of the business and maintaining your IP position. But it is manageable, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's really key for any business, irrespective of size, but especially for smaller companies, that the IP strategy informs the commercial strategy, which in turn informs the IP strategy. There's a circle going on here, and you need to be constantly thinking about what it is that you're doing in your innovation. How are you protecting it, and then how are you commercializing that? And if any one of those links is not quite joined up, then that's where money tends to seep out and be lost. If you can join those up, you tend to see the benefit of putting money into innovation, because you can protect it, then you can commercialize it, and you're preventing others from getting in on your territory. And I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, that is, all kinds of SMEs tend to have very few physical assets. They may rent premises, they may rent equipment, they employ their employees, they don't own many things. It may be that their IP, whether that is patents or designs or trademarks, their brand, might be one of their only assets. Or indeed, if they sell products, their products may be sat in a warehouse, and if a competitor is undercutting them because they've stolen their IP, their brand, their technology, then that physical asset of stock could drop in price, and therefore be less valuable.
I think that makes sense. What you're saying about the need to tie your IP strategy to the commercial strategy is key in this idea of, well, the real value being in what you can protect, with intellectual property rights. And I think that helps map maybe almost, the lifetime of the business as an individual running it might see it, depending on what the plan is. If the plan is to get investment or to, sell it and exit, then often the intellectual property rights that do protect and maintain your unique selling point, whether that's a service or a product, having that there for an investor, say, gives that company individual confidence to invest, knowing that their investment's going to be safe. The valuation of the company, well, we can sell this many products at this amount. That should be maintained if you can keep others off the market. And therefore, I do think that IP does have an important role in allowing companies to, well, first develop a business plan, and then to be able to execute it and to hit the milestones that they set themselves. And I think as well, one thing that you can learn from the Colin Cuthbert battle, shall we say, is that it's not just battle of caterpillar cakes. It sounds more like a food fight, doesn't it? But I think one thing that you can learn from there is it's not only your intellectual property that you've kind of got to keep an eye on. Other individuals, other companies will have their own IP, whether that's patents or trademarks, and it's something to bear in mind that could also impact on your ability as a company to commercialize what you want to, whether it's a service or a cake maybe.
And actually that is a really good point, because especially for small companies, they may not think about other players in the market having intellectual property that could prevent them from commercializing what they want to commercialize, and particularly if that intellectual property is owned by a big company that's got deep pockets, that could make life very, very difficult for an SME. So being aware of that is really important.
That general term to sort of us IP geeks is freedom to operate. So that's a watchword to look out for. But it is always worth keeping in mind. I think sometimes generally companies can be quite good at their own surveillance. They often know what their competitors are doing, but there can sometimes be hidden intellectual property out there from people that you didn't know were in this particular market that can cause issues. So it's always worth keeping in the back of your mind, particularly when you're talking to your advisors or others about intellectual property. So anything else that we can say on creating value from innovation, or should we try and hit sort of 3 key points that we can take away from this conversation?
Right. I think we can probably do some quick take homes, can't we?
Okay, so number 1 on your top 3, Jane, would be
the innovation and associated IP does have value. It may not be obvious, it may not be much, but it always will have some value to you or to somebody else.
Okay, no, that makes sense to me. Number 2?
It's remembering that your innovation and IP strategy really needs to fit with your commercial strategy, which necessarily is going to fit with what is happening in the real world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And number 3 is?
Finally, it comes back to that final point that we were just talking about, is freedom to operate, and remembering that other people have IP and innovation. So you really need to be careful that you don't step on those toes. You don't want to be the Cuthbert. No one wants to be the Cuthbert at the moment, I think. No, that was great. Thank you so much for that, Jane. And I hope if you've listened up to this point that you've enjoyed it. Jane and myself, we're from Potter Clarkson. We're a full service intellectual property law firm dealing with patents, trademarks, designs, licenses, litigation should you need. So if you've got any questions about the topics that we've discussed today, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can download this podcast from all your usual sources, and you can get great up-to-date information on things in the IP world, either from our Potter Clarkson website or our LinkedIn and Twitter feeds. So just want to say thank you, Jane. And just before we go, are you Team Colin or Team Cuthbert? I'm Team Cake. Team Cake, I like that. Sitting on the fence. But if you're listening and want to get in touch to just tell us whether you're Team Colin, Team Cuthbert, then that'd be interesting. We might run a poll if there's enough interest. But thank you very much for listening, and take care. Thanks, everybody.